The Dead Space franchise dominated the late 2000s and early 2010s video game space. The series blended the survival horror elements with thrilling action gameplay, all while creating a world and story that players wanted to uncover. So what happened to the series? Visceral Games, the developer behind the series, did have plans after Dead Space 3 to continue the franchise and make Dead Space 4. Dead Space 3 was released in 2013, but the fourth entry never became anything more than just ideas. Let's break down why Dead Space 4 was cancelled and everything we knew about the game and Visceral's original plan. As always, all the links to the sources will be down below, so make sure to check those out and support. And with that out of the way, let's get right into it. The first Dead Space flew onto the scene in October of 2008. It was constantly mentioned in the conversation of one of the greatest video games of all time and went on to sell over 2 million copies. Just 3 years later, in January of 2011, the sequel would release Dead Space 2, which was set 3 years after the original game, and is cited as one of the most expensive video games ever made with a budget of $120 million. Now, half of that was used as the marketing budget, which is worth noting, but they still were given $60 million to make the game. During the first week after its release, it was reported that this game shipped nearly 2 million copies, which is not the same as selling 2 million copies, and as of now, it is estimated that the game has sold around 4 million copies worldwide. And the game was still met with heavy praise by fans and critics alike, and if fans liked the first game, it was more of the same, but with more action and less survival horror. Then, 2 years later, Dead Space 3 would be released, and would be the final Dead Space game developed by Visceral Games at the time of recording. Now, this game added heavy co-op mechanics in the game, microtransactions, and was met with more mixed reviews than the previous entries. Once again, it seemed the series had strayed further from survival horror, and was more into a big budget action game with some horror elements. The sales of Dead Space 3 failed to meet EA's expectations, and the game sold a little over 600,000 copies in North America during its first month. The CFO of EA, Blake Jorgensen, said the game came in, quote, below our forecasts, but no specific details were given. In the past, EA had said for a game to be successful and for them to continue to produce these games, their normal, bigger series would need to sell 5 million copies worldwide. Now, even at the peak, it looks like Dead Space 2 didn't even hit that, which we mentioned only sold 4 million copies worldwide after many years. And with the poor word of mouth around Dead Space 3 and some mixed reviews, that game did not even come close. Now, with all of that context, let's jump to March of 2013. Only 1 month after the initial release of Dead Space 3. A story was released by Videogamer.com, which claimed that pre-production had already started at Visceral Games and Visceral Games Montreal, but after the lackluster release of Dead Space 3, they were told by EA to drop development for Dead Space 4, and they were not going to continue the franchise. At the time, EA denied the story and accused Videogamer.com of fabricating the story to get cheap clicks, and that the franchise, quote, remains an important IP to EA. Then in June of 2013, just 3 months later, EA gave an update on Dead Space 4 to Eurogamer. The EA Games label boss, Patrick Sutherland, denied that Dead Space has been cancelled altogether, but did confirm that Dead Space 4, which was in pre-production, was not in the works anymore. He said, quote, "Is that team working on a Dead Space game today? No, they're not. They're working on something else very exciting. You have to think of it from that perspective. It is better to put them on a fourth version of a game they've done 3 previous entries of before, or is it better to put them on something new that they want to build, that they have a passion for? I am of the utmost opinion that we have put the best possible games in the hands of our fans. How you get a great game, the first thing you need is a great development team that have a passion for building what they're building. That's a simple parameter, everything else follows. Money, time, everything else. It's less relevant. That's ultimately how you get success. It's as simple as that." Then news around Dead Space was quiet until October of 2017, when it was announced that EA was shutting down Visceral Games. And at the time it was thought that Dead Space 4 was completely dead and we'd never hear anything else about it. Until 1 year later, in July of 2018, Eurogamer interviewed Ben Wannett, who was the creative director of Dead Space and is now the creative director at Crystal Dynamics, and they spoke to him about some more details of Dead Space 4 before it was canceled. So what details does this article give us? Well, in terms of gameplay, they mentioned that in Dead Space 3, they had started to toy around with the idea of non-linear gameplay, and they wanted to explore those ideas to an even greater extent in Dead Space 4. Which would give the players the option to scavenge around abandoned ships for supplies and to make additions to your ship. Now, that doesn't mean it would be a completely open world game. It would still be a hybrid of linear and non-linear gameplay, but the game would start in an open section of space and you would find infected ships along the way as you travel with your own ship, which you could board and get pieces of the story as you hit more ships. Then you would get enough parts of your ship to become shock capable and travel to nearby sections. The team was also in the early stages of looking at a variety of different ship layouts to use in the game, which would change the ship type with unique purposes, floor plans, and gameplay. They also wanted to take another look at the crafting system in-game, especially after Dead Space 3, because of how easy it was to break the game with weapon modifications. So they wanted to fix that aspect while still allowing the players to use Isaac's mechanic background. The necromorphs would also be updated to accommodate the more open area. They would now be able to follow you through zero-G environments, which would make them more of a threat in whatever environment you are in, and then you would have to decide whether you'd want to fight them in zero-G environments or on ground on your own feet, and it would just add more variety to the gameplay. Now, the ending of Dead Space 3 does set up a sequel. An Easter egg in all the Dead Space games is once you take the first letter of all the chapters in game, they usually spell something. So in this game, they spell, quote, "Brother Moons are awake." In Dead Space 3, we learned that the signal that we have been tracking to Tau Volantis is really from a nearby moon. And the entire moon was frozen to prevent the markers on the Brother Moon from communicating with the other markers and necromorphing the entire galaxy. We do destroy the moon in game, but because the chapters spell "Our brother moons are awake," it is speculated that there are more moons than just one, and then we hear Isaac say Ellie's name. With that in mind, for Dead Space 4, they mentioned they wanted to keep the story open for future installments, and they could have seen the story either continue playing as Isaac, Carver, or even Ellie, or possibly even a new character. They said with the apocalypse, there was an opportunity for a clean break. It wouldn't necessarily be the story going forward to include any of them. And he also said he'd love to do a game with Ellie at the helm, and he had, quote, imagined her as the protagonist of Dead Space 4. But ultimately, the game did not make it much further than the story team. Most of the team was still working on Dead Space 3 at the time, and the other members were working on new projects. Once it had become apparent Dead Space 3 would be the last entry in the franchise after lackluster sales. He does go on to mention that while the series might not be as profitable for a AAA budget or AAA title like what EA wants, it could still possibly work as a smaller title, which would only keep the essential gameplay elements. The dread, the horror, and dismemberment combat were some of the key aspects he mentioned that would be kept, and they could cut out some of the more heavy action sequences to trim down on the budget, and if they still wanted to make these games for the dedicated fans. They close out by saying the future of the series, they had already thought of ideas for the origin of the necromorphs, and they do know that, and the role humans play in that story. He goes on to say the original story for Dead Space 4 had an ending, but he wanted to keep it a secret in case EA decides to revisit the series. He closes saying that players would find a way out of the necromorph apocalypse, but they might be sorry they did. Sometimes you're better off with the devil you know. Now, the last piece of information comes from March of 2019. The creator of the Dead Space series went on the Game Informer show podcast, and he mentioned he still would be willing to return to the franchise and make Dead Space 4, which obviously got fans hyped up.
If you could make a sequel to any game, what would you go for?
Yeah, of course it would be Dead Space. That would be one I'd love to do a sequel for someday.
Like Dead Space 4 or like kind of like a confusing Dead Space 2?
No, I'd probably... I wouldn't say that the other twos existed. I helped do a lot on number two. But I would probably do something that I didn't have to follow some of the lore of the other two.
Just because it got pretty complex over there towards the end?
A bit, yeah. I actually thought in the end, like when they introduced all the aliens and everything, I was like, wow, you didn't need to. You got necromorphs, right?
Yeah.
Why didn't you need anything more? But it did beg the question, who started who came up with the marker, so I understand all that.
But at the end of the day, it comes down to EA. They're the ones that hold the IP, so while Visceral Games might be closed, it's possible could give this franchise to a different developer, modify it, reboot it a lot of different ways, and I don't see them keeping Dead Space 4 dead for forever. It does have name recognition, horror elements, and I think if they did it right, they could do a really big reboot and get people back interested in the series. And that's why Dead Space 4 was canceled and everything we know about it. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like and share this video, subscribe for weekly gaming news, and I will see you guys in the next one.